The Unforgiven. The stadium roared with excitement as the San Francisco Giants took the lead, the crowd surging to its feet in a wave of orange and black. John sat among them, clutching his plastic cup of beer, watching the team edge closer to victory. The energy was electric, high fives exchanged between strangers, cheers echoing throughout the stands, but none of it seemed to penetrate the quiet loneliness sitting heavy in John's chest. He'd gotten the tickets for free through work, part of this business trip he'd half-heartedly volunteered for. On paper, it was a nice perk, but in reality, sitting alone in a sea of strangers only made the absence of companionship more glaring. He sipped his beer and glanced around. Families, couples, groups of friends, everyone seemed to have someone. John couldn't help but feel like an outsider, stuck in his own little bubble of isolation despite the thousands of people surrounding him. He tried to enjoy the game, really. He'd even bought himself a Giants cap from the souvenir stand, hoping the little act of participating in the fanfare might lift his spirits. But the cap now sat on the seat beside him, untouched. He wished someone had come with him. His co-workers were all back at the hotel, too tired after a day of meetings to bother with a late-night ballgame. And who could blame them? It was a nice gesture from the company to give out free tickets, but it was hard to enjoy it when the people around you were more interested in unwinding in their rooms than cheering at the park. John had debated staying in too, but something about sitting alone in his hotel room felt even worse. So here he was watching the Giants win, trying to muster some excitement. But each time he cheered, it felt hollow. The emptiness gnawed at him. There was something about being in a crowd like this, surrounded by life, by joy, by connection, that only deepened the sadness he'd been trying to keep at bay. Another cheer erupted from the stands as the Giants hit a single, driving in another run, and John stood up, clapping along with the crowd, forcing a smile. He wanted to feel something, anything, other than the strange mix of sadness and detachment that had been lingering all day. He glanced at his phone, thinking briefly about texting someone, maybe a coworker back at the hotel or even an old friend back home. But the idea of trying to explain how he was feeling in a few short words felt exhausting. Instead, he pocketed his phone and sat back down, watching the players hustle across the diamond under the bright stadium lights. Despite everything, there was a part of him that loved the simplicity of the game, the clean lines of the field, the way each play unfolded with precision and purpose. For a few moments, he allowed himself to get lost in the rhythm of it, the crack of the bat, the cheers, the announcer's voice booming over the speakers. But even that distraction was fleeting. The loneliness crept back in, heavier now, and John couldn't help but wonder why being here, at a game most people would kill for free tickets to, made him feel so empty. The Giants were winning. The stadium was alive. And yet, John sat alone, the void inside him growing deeper as the night wore on. As the final out was made and the Giants secured their victory, the stadium erupted into a deafening roar of cheers and applause. John stood and clapped along, forcing a small smile as the people around him celebrated, high-fiving and hugging one another. He watched as families gathered their things, friends exchanged excited words about the game, and couples leaned into each other, sharing the moment. But for John, the thrill of the win faded as quickly as it had come. The surge of adrenaline, the distraction of the game, it had all been temporary. As the crowd began to thin and the buzz of excitement drifted away, John remained in his seat, sinking back into it as the emptiness inside him grew louder. The game was over, but the feeling that had been gnawing at him all night still clung to him, heavier now that the noise and the crowds were disappearing. John leaned back in his seat, staring out over the emptying stadium as the crowd slowly dissipated into the night. The game had ended hours ago, but he stayed behind, feeling the weight of the world settle back onto his shoulders. The energy of the crowd, the highs and lows of the game, had briefly distracted him, but now that the noise was fading, the hollow feeling in his chest returned. He watched as families, couples, and groups of friends filed out, their laughter and excited conversations floating up into the cool night air. John envied their lightness, the way they could just enjoy a game and then return to their normal lives, unburdened by the heavy thoughts that always seemed to linger at the edges of his mind. The stadium lights remained on, casting long shadows across the field, and John found himself lost in the sight of the emptying seats. He stayed planted in his chair, hoping that the quiet would bring him some clarity, some peace. But instead, it just amplified the sense of isolation creeping in around him. He shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets and exhaled, watching the last few stragglers make their way up the aisles. The buzz of life was fading away, and soon it would just be him and the empty stands. This was familiar. The feeling of being left behind, of watching the world move on while he remained stuck in place, always waiting for something, though he was never quite sure what. As the stadium grew quieter, John stood, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He wasn't ready to leave, not just yet. There was something comforting about the stillness, even though it echoed the heaviness he carried inside. He slowly made his way down the steps toward the field, his footsteps barely audible against the concrete, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the now silent arena. He reached the edge of the field and stood there, hands resting on the railing, staring at the infield. The grass perfectly manicured, the bases illuminated by the soft glow of the remaining stadium lights. It was here, in this emptiness, that John felt both insignificant and strangely alive. It was as if the field, now deserted and silent, understood him in ways people never could. It had seen the crowds, the cheers, the highs, and the lows. And now, like John, it was waiting for something unknown. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the crisp night air. Maybe tonight, he'd stay just a little longer. Maybe in the quiet, he'd find whatever it was he'd been waiting for all this time. John's eyes remained closed, lost in the solitude of the moment, when suddenly, the soft whisper of a guitar echoed across the stadium. His brow furrowed, and he opened his eyes, scanning the empty field. The once quiet arena now hummed with an unmistakable tension, a vibration in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, there they were, Jesus and his band stepping out of the mist, adorned in San Francisco Giants uniforms. Jesus, muscular and radiant, his electric guitar slung low across his chest, was at the center of it all. His presence was commanding yet serene, his massive angel wings outstretched behind him, glowing with what looked like millions of tiny lights. Each feather seemed to radiate a warm golden glow, casting an ethereal light over the entire stadium. The air around him shimmered as though it too was alive with energy, illuminated by the bright, otherworldly light emanating from his wings. The mist that swirled at his feet reflected the glow, creating an aura that enveloped him, making him appear both grounded and transcendent at the same time. He was beautiful in a way that defied earthly description. His muscular frame, chiseled and perfect, moved with effortless grace as he moved to play his guitar. His bronzed skin, kissed by some celestial sun, gleamed under the stadium lights. Every muscle defined and powerful. His arms, strong and sinewy, seemed made for both battle and compassion, veins running down to his large, capable hands as they moved over the guitar strings. His dark brown hair, perfectly tied in a loose man bun, gave him an air of ruggedness, contrasting with the softness of his face. And his eyes, those piercing, gorgeous green eyes, seemed to hold the universe within them. They glowed with a light of their own, a deep, soulful gaze that saw through to the very core of whoever they looked upon, offering both comfort and challenge. His presence was overwhelming, divine, and yet deeply human all at once, as if the very essence of beauty and strength had taken form in him. Beside him, a drummer began tapping out a slow, deliberate beat, the bass guitarist filling the space with deep, resonant notes. John blinked, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. Then it happened. Jesus strummed the first heavy chord of Metallica's The Unforgiven, and John felt it like a jolt to his core. The opening riff hung in the air like a thread, and with each note, it wove its way into John's very soul. The song's melancholy melody stretched over the field, and John stood frozen, every note, every beat slicing through him with raw precision. John's chest tightened as the haunting notes of the guitar filled the air. No words, just music. The raw, slow melody of The Unforgiven echoed through the empty stadium, weaving into the very fabric of the night. It was heavy, unrelenting, and somehow exactly what he needed. Each chord reverberated in the silence, amplifying the weight of everything John had been trying to suppress for so long. The riff cut through the stillness like a blade, each note carrying with it a kind of understanding, a reflection of the internal battle John had fought for years. It was as if the music alone was enough to speak to his soul, telling him what he had always been too afraid to admit, that he was lost, buried under the weight of his own expectations, the crushing need for redemption he couldn't seem to grasp. The music didn't need words. It spoke the language of pain, of regret, of longing. The soft intro rolled through John like a wave, pulling at every hurt he'd buried, every moment of self-doubt and self-loathing. The heavy strum of the guitar felt like it was dragging those feelings to the surface, exposing them under the unforgiving stadium lights. Now there was no escaping it. The music was forcing him to face everything he tried to outrun. All the years of running from his pain, pushing it down, hiding it behind a haze of addiction, came rushing to the surface with the music. He had buried so much beneath the drugs, the temporary highs that dulled his senses just enough to forget, if only for a moment. But the relief never lasted, and the emptiness always returned, worse than before. It wasn't just about losing Chandler or Jennifer, though their absence haunted him. It was the shame, the guilt that clung to him like a shadow, the sense that he had never been enough for anyone. He had used the drugs to escape, to numb the sting of self-loathing, the crushing feeling that he was unworthy of love, of forgiveness. Every hit, every high was an attempt to quiet the relentless voices in his head, telling him he'd failed. Failed Chandler, failed Jennifer, and worst of all, failed himself. But as the guitar wailed into the night, there was no more hiding. The music cracked open the walls he had so carefully built, exposing the raw wound he'd been running from all this time. John leaned forward, gripping the railing in front of him, his knuckles white. The music swelled, rising and falling like the tides of his own emotional state. There was something cathartic about the way the guitar cried out, the way it seemed to voice every unspoken thought John had locked away. Each riff felt like a confession, like the music was calling out everything he had refused to say, and yet it wasn't accusing. It wasn't condemning, it was understanding. The rhythm surged, and John's pulse quickened to match it, the drum beat pounding in sync with his heartbeat. The music wasn't just in his ears, it was inside him, tunneling through the layers of defenses he'd built over the years. But here, beneath the vast expanse of the night sky, with no crowd to witness, John didn't have to pretend. He could just be. The music wasn't playing for him, it was playing through him. Each note pierced the ache that had quietly gnawed at his soul for as long as he could remember. The electric guitar's wail mirrored the silent screams he had long buried. And somehow, through those strings, Jesus was telling him it was okay to feel every bit of it. There was no shame in the struggle, only release. The crescendo rose, sweeping across the empty field, and John closed his eyes, surrendering to it. He didn't need the lyrics. The music carried the weight of everything unsaid, the burden of forgiveness sought but never granted. It filled the space inside him, unearthing all the pieces he had been too afraid to examine. When the solo hit, the notes soared higher, cutting through the night like a beacon. It was beautiful in its brokenness, every wailing string lingering like an unanswered question. But John didn't need the answer anymore. The music wasn't there to give him one. It was urging him to let go of the need for it, to surrender to the uncertainty, and trust in something greater than himself. As the final notes faded into the cool night, John felt a shift deep within. The stadium was silent, the music gone, but the weight in his chest had lightened, if only by a fraction. John opened his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he didn't feel the need to fill the void. He let the silence settle. Just as the music had been enough, so too was the stillness. Jesus stood there, guitar in hand, bathed in the soft glow of the stadium lights. No words were spoken, no grand revelations exchanged, just a quiet understanding, as if the music had said what words never could. It had reached into John's soul and told him the one truth he had always needed. He was not alone.